terrorist organization, and we work in solidarity with the occupied and oppressed Palestinians. As South Africans, we feel that we have a particular responsibility, given the affinity that there was historically between white apartheid and Israeli apartheid, and the solidarity that was offered by the Palestinian Solidarity Movement to South Africans. And so our task is to expand that solidarity to the rest of the continent, where, of course, Israel is attempting to make significant inroads. Today, we have the honor of having Comrade Lindsay Collen with us. She's well, I think a former South African activist living in Mauritius. As a writer, she had 7 novels published. Twice she won the Commonwealth Prize for the best novel from Africa. Her work is being published in French, Dutch, Turkish, German, Danish, and Mauritian Creole. She was born in Mqanduli, which earns itself exactly 2 lines on Wikipedia. It's a town in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, in the Oliver Tambo district municipality. You know, many a times people ask us in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, what about this? What about that? What about this country? What about that country? Without failing to take cognizance of our lives. And Comrade Lindsay is one of those characters whose whole life straddles a commitment to various kinds of struggle. From the early 60s as a student at Wits University in Johannesburg, she was active in student politics, demonstrations against apartheid in education, and against the US war in Vietnam. Later, when living in London at the London School of Economics, she was engaged in solidarity with Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau against Portuguese colonialization at that time. When she visited her partner, Ramsey Gobin's family in Mauritius in '74, she found the situation quite fitting for a character, very lively, she says, and she decided to stay. From '76 onwards, she was engaged in a publication, La Lutte de Classe, a class struggle, and it later became a political group, and later the Left Party in Mauritius, La Lutte. And from the '70s onwards, she has been working on Palestine solidarity issues. She's a grassroots trade unionist and has been involved in several nationwide mass movements there. She's also been active in the women's movement against patriarchy and very constant in her support for Palestine, active in workers' education, adult solidarity amongst in the homeless people's movement from 1992 until now. And of course, she's been active in the anti-apartheid movement in Mauritius called SOMAP. And there she worked with an illustrious character in South Africa's history, Archbishop Trevor Huddleston. He was then Bishop of Mauritius, and he was the founder of the international anti-apartheid movement. So they've been more focused since 2004 on support for Palestine, but there has been a lot of work at an informal common front level with other unions and social movements in Mauritius. And so it all flowed very, very naturally for her from the one form of apartheid to the other form of apartheid. And she particularly remembers one of the comrades in South Africa who assisted her in making the links with other comrades inside Palestine, when she fondly remembers the role that Comrade Salim Valley has played in getting her to make those connections. So without further ado, Comrade Lindsay, it's over to you, and I'll hit off with the first question. So your organization, it's among several Mauritius organizations that formed a new common front called Mauritians in Solidarity with the People of Palestine, No to Israeli Apartheid. Can you tell us a bit about the formation of that movement in the context of Mauritian left politics? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Farid. And first, I'd really like to say how it's very important for us in Lalit and also for all of the organizations and individuals setting up this new common front, for us to be able to work together with Africa for Palestine, because we think that at this time in history, it's a moment when perhaps as the people of Africa, with a kind of Pan-African view, we can help to advance the Palestinian struggle. And it's a moment when the broad masses of people in Palestine, and I might even add many people within Israel as well, they're up against a state apparatus, the Israeli state apparatus, with its partner, the US. And under Trump, there was Mohammed bin Salman as well in a tight formation that makes for a huge dominating state apparatus on the heads of the people there. So they really do need a hand. About the organization that we've just set up, I'll give some idea from the point of view of Lalit. We can say it was like in 3 phases. From the 1970s until about 204, we did mainly work that was, taking stands or open letters, articles, and, putting pressure on the Mauritian state to keep, in line in the UN on the Palestinian issue. And then it was around 2003, 2004, when there were a few things that were quite important that took place. The first thing that was important from our point of view is that we decided to send 2 of our members, or they wanted to go as well, to Palestine as part of what used to be called international brigades. That's solidarity work where you go and give hands-on help in a struggle that needs you. And then that really helps you to understand what occupation means. Because really before they gave the report backs, I must say, speaking for myself, I didn't really know what it meant to talk about occupation. So that was a very important change in 2003, 2004. And at the same time, in 2003, there was an important case at the ICJ that the Palestinian people put forward against the wall, that illegal wall that winds through and carves up Palestine that the Israeli state has built. And for years and years, we had been struggling here in Mauritius on an issue that's similar. So in the same way as South Africans share with the people of Palestine, a kind of apartheid systems domination, we share with the people of Palestine the fact that there's military occupation of part of Mauritian territory. And this has been one of the struggles in which we in Lalit have been very involved, and women in the women's movement and the people of Chagos who were forcibly removed. And perhaps I can have a couple of minutes to outline this struggle because it's not that well known.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. And what happened is in 1967, which is the very time when the occupation by Israel of the whole of the West Bank and Jerusalem, and for a long time Gaza, which then afterwards is just now under a state of siege, at the same time as that was happening, at the same time as I was at WITS in those movements against the Vietnam War, at that moment in history, we had a situation where Mauritius was going towards its independence. And as a country is heading for its independence, we have to remember that after the Second World War in the 1940s, when the UN system was set up, colonization was made anathema. It was supposed to be abolished, and it became reviled. And so this is important to remember because when we get to 1967, the British state with its ally, the US, that was really wanting and felt needing a military base in the Indian Ocean to control the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, and the whole Indian Ocean. And they set their aim at getting part of the Mauritian state. And so as late as 1967, that's 20 years after colonization is anathema, the British state, with the help of the American army, stole part of Mauritian territory, the whole of the Chagos Islands, which is 60 islands. And one of these islands, Chagos Islands, the British state acted by sort of subletting it to the US, that became like the receiver of the stolen goods. And they set up this huge military base there. And the British state did this. It was a Harold Wilson government, which is interesting, a Labour government.
Yes.
And, you know, they had a problem because these were not uninhabited islands, although they pretended they were. So as late as 1967, we had this terra nullius explanation or justification of colonization, which had already been kind of, you know, supposedly renounced by the whole UN system. And anyway, they set up the base, and there were thousands of people living there on 6 of the islands, of the 60 islands. And so they became British because the island was set up, the colony was set up. It was called British Indian Ocean Territory, BIOT. And hardly anyone even knows it existed. And we fought, along with other people, especially the Chagosians who were displaced forcibly from the islands, we fought to put this on the agenda, literally for 45 years. And so this has been a long and hard struggle. And I won't go into it in detail, it's not the time to do it, but just to say that we've had some huge victories that are linked to the Palestinians having taught us to use the ICJ. We'd been trying to suggest using that from the 70s. But when we saw how the war case worked, we really put pressure on the government, together with other trade union organizations and individuals in Mauritius who've taken a good stand. And so we got our government to use the UN system, first the Labour government, and then the Jugnut government in 2016. And the judgment came in the UN, in the ICJ case, in 2019. And it was a fantastic judgment. And it said it's completely illegal and that Britain has to get out within 6 months. But it put the onus on the UN General Assembly to take a decision, which it did. So again, we organized people as well in other countries to get their representatives to vote well and everything. And Britain and the US were completely isolated. With them, they got Israel, they got the Australians, Hungarian government, and Maldives government that they tried to sort of trick to be in there. And then just to update it completely, this year, there's been a kind of knockout blow given by the International Tribunal under the Law of the Sea, which is a binding treaty and which has lent upon the ICJ advisory opinion to declare it illegal. So, you know, just to show how these long struggles where you try to change the balance of forces by informing people, by being an activist, and also at the same time using your own government and the UN system. And so that is really how we've come towards, from 2003 until now, working as common fronts. Not just Lalit, but common fronts with other organizations.
Thanks so much for that bit of historical background. It's fascinating. I know a bit about it, but yes, I mean, especially the struggles of smaller peoples, lesser known, it's far out. How do you get the media there? So thank you very much. I really appreciate it and for helping us to make those connections.
And can I come up to the present when we came to setting up this front, what allowed it? Because I think it's interesting. It may help other people in Africa who want to give a hand. You know, what we found from 2003 until now, I'm talking about over 15 years, however much we worked together with other organizations regularly, with doing a common letter, but always sort of ad hoc, or we would do, you know, a petition, or we would do a series of forums, or show films on Palestine, vigils, night vigils, you know, and that kind of thing. But it was never really easy to think of setting up a common front, a formal common front, which gives a lot more power because you can be proactive because you're all together. A few things helped us. Two things. One of them is not such a good thing to have helped us, and that's that there has been slightly more Israeli presence in Mauritius. So the BDS part of the work that we'd started to do with other organizations has now become practically possible. But perhaps equally important, or maybe even more important, you know, there was an ideological problem because the whole of all our allies, and with reason in a way, and you know, they say that there's still the two-state solution. And we in Lalit have seen how the Israeli state has ruined the two-state solution over the decades until it's so hard, you know, it's hard to make a common front where you can't get this sorted. And then suddenly, when those 450 organizations supporting Palestine came up with the idea of working together worldwide and with a particularly strong African section towards getting an official inquiry by the UN system to declare the Israeli state an apartheid state, which is a crime against humanity, you know, for decades now. Yes. And that allows us, it sort of dissolves that binary between there being something contradictory about one or two states. We say, whatever it is, we accuse Israel, the Israeli state, of an apartheid regime. And this has allowed us to come together and make this common front that's just been set up on the 31st of December. The organizations in it, just if I can follow up, to give an idea, there are 4 of the trade union federations, and there's an organization that works on consumer rights. There's another organization, this is interesting. They are in an area where there are quite a few Muslim people who know about the Palestinian cause through their religion, as it were. And a group there, about 12 years ago, decided to have a demonstration that they wanted a demonstration that wasn't like from a religious point of view only. And they organized a demonstration, and Lalit people went, and we really got into a very close alliance with them because there was the biggest downpour, and tropical downpours we used to, but this was a huge one. And we maintained this demonstration in the huge downpour. And so they also in the common front, Sant Gumani. There's the Women's Liberation Organization that I'm also a member of. And then there's the group that's in power, the majority group in the Chagos refugees group. The people forcibly removed from Chagos are also in this common front, plus 42 individuals. That's just to set it up. And amongst the individuals, we've had a lot of support over the years from a former president of the Republic, Kassam Utin. And also there's a former Attorney General, Jean-Claude Bibi, who gives a hand. So we've had, you know, help from individuals who've shown remarkable commitment to a long struggle. And so now we really want to help with the Africa for Palestine movement as part of Africa, not so small, because when you add the sea that Mauritius has to the land, we are the 18th biggest country.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for that. Thank you very, very much for that, Comrade Lindsay. So, Comrade Lindsay, I want to ask you about what's the kind of the history of the Palestine-Mauritius relations or alliance. I mean, the South African narrative, it's widely known, you know, through the PLO and the ANC on the one hand, and the Israeli apartheid regime with the South African apartheid regime on the other. What are some of the historical things that goes on in Mauritian-Palestine relations on the one hand, or Mauritian-Israeli relations on the other?
You know, in Mauritius, there's always been a close relationship between the Mauritian political parties, all the mainstream political parties. They really, if they want to be elected, they have to say that they're in favor of the people of Palestine.
That's wonderful to start with.
Yeah, I know, it's unbelievable. So far, I must say so far, because, and here I'm opening a kind of parenthesis, in the last year or so, there's been this amazing populist movement that's grown up in Mauritius, criticizing the government on things like corruption and that kind of thing. And it's led by a man who was trained by the Israeli military. And he's got a security company. And, you know, something like this is most unusual in Mauritius. So that's why I say up till now, because this is a new and slightly worrying phenomenon. But anyway, to get back to the history, at the time of independence, the Labour Party under Siwu Segar Ramgoolam was in power. And he was always one of those people who was very close to the non-aligned movement and to the PLO, sorry, I'm saying it in Creole, the PLO. But it was very much like lip service. But I must say that even the more right-wing parties, like the anti-independence PMSD party, while it was pro-apartheid, it was never really as much pro-Israeli. They did have some members who were like the representatives for trade and that. So what you can say is that the political parties are always supportive. And in the UN, we haven't been able to catch the government out doing the wrong thing. But they have rarely done anything, you know, an initiative or do something positive or add something, which is tragic because Mauritius has benefited so much from working in SADC, in the African Union, in putting that case that I was saying that was won. So I think we, as a state, we really owe it to the Palestinian people that the state here takes an initiative. There was only once at the time of the bombardment of Gaza, I think it was 2008, 2009, perhaps at the end of the year, beginning of the year, the Mauritian government, under pressure from us and the other organizations that give a hand, the government suspended the little bit of economic relations, what's it called, when you have like a trade consul, they were suspended because of that bombardment. So that was quite an interesting, something positive that the government did.
Yeah. But I mean, I mean, if a country like South Africa, you know, on this question, then one can understand much more pressure on a smaller country like Mauritius by its international allies in this regard, say France, more than the United States can kind of behind the scenes probably bring a lot of force to bear to quote unquote moderate the Mauritian government's position.
Yeah, and now we have an additional problem in that since Modi, there's been this Modi-Trump alliance, so that the position of India on the world scene is also different from what it was before. This is an added problem from the point of view of pressure.
Yes, of course. And even in this case, I mean, I think that the Trump regime really has done a lot to lean on many other governments to take a softer line on Israel and so on. Although, of course, I don't know if we can expect, I guess, a difference in appearance and more gentleness in which this glove of imperialism exercises itself. The velvet will become thicker around the gloves, but whether the steel and the energy behind imperialism's force will change, I mean, I don't even have to say that is left to be seen. So, so some of your comrades, they went to Palestine. One of them in Lalit was also a part of the naval naval attempt on to what do we call it, the flotilla, and so some of them, but all some of them actually went to Palestine, and there they brought some of this experience back. How does personal narrative or personal stories about having been there, how did it impact on others in the organization, if at all?
Well, I think it's been absolutely key. You know, that's a really fantastic question, because I suppose we all subject to the media that we learn from, especially television, where there's this picture of two equal people in a fight, you know, the Israelis and the Palestinians, as though there's some kind of something
like
comparable.
There's a domestic dispute, and meanwhile the woman is being pulped to death.
Yes, that's quite a good. That's quite a good description. Argument. And
carry on.
What really helped us then was when, you know, first of all, when they tried to get a ticket to go, so they would go past South Africa first and get briefed and helped by Salim and others, Salim Valley and others in South Africa from Palestine Solidarity at the time to go over. And, you know, we learned that you can't go to Palestine. You have to invent a lie. So you have to know that you've got to invent a lie to go to Palestine. And you've got to embroider something about how you're visiting something in Israel and get a whole personality that goes with this. And then also, you know, they had, you know, the day-to-day life of Palestinians became so clear to us. One of our members, a woman member, went twice to something called the House through an international women's organization for peace. And at this thing called the House in Haris, in Palestine, they would be standby. So she lived there. And every time children, Palestinian children, were arrested, they would get called up like an SOS call. And they would be like eyes of the world, you know, a few women looking and intervening and negotiating. And then they would be helped by Palestinian organizations and some Israeli organizations that would help for the release of the children. And then the Palestinian people, they would take them into their homes, so we know what people eat and how they live and how they survive with, you know, all the human dignity and all the pride of people who have really been, you know, heroes and heroines, and that they do it as a way of life. And we really learned this from their visits, you know. That was Ragini Kisnasamy who went there twice. And then a man, comrade of ours in Lalit, Ala Avi, he went on a march in 2003 or 4 along the wall. Now, this was quite a hard one. That, you know, they would try to get through all the gates in the wall. And this wall is not between Palestine and Israel on the 1967 lines. No, it's within Palestine, and it separates people from their own olive orchards. That was another thing that the woman comrade did. And the second time she went there, she would go to help people get to their orchard to be able to look after their olive trees. Anyway, the male friend, when they would come along the wall, they would stop at villages, and each village would receive them to stay in people's homes. And then the next day, people would walk along with them till the next, you know, for a few hours. And then they also saw how, you know, sometimes little children would follow them, and the children, when they would see the army, they get very cross and throw stones because they're quite traumatized and have experienced very tough times. And then they would have to debate, you know, how do you stop Palestinian children? Who are you to stop even a Palestinian child from throwing stones? So it was like philosophical training as well. And sometimes they would get quite a lot of those sound bombs and masses of tear gas. Alain says compared with Mauritian tear gas, about 5 or 6 times as much. And then also rubber bullets quite often. And so they really had quite a tough time, but also integrated with the people. And we learned also then really that for the masses of the people that they met, mainly in rural areas, but also in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, the desire was really, we already started to feel it was for equal rights for everybody in this land. This two-state solution had already kind of been shaken by the ordinary people in Palestine. And this was very important for us to learn. And I think, you know, when they would come back, they would tell stories in small groups and in big groups and before a film or before you know, an analysis that someone else is going to do. And it really would make it as if we were there ourselves. That's what the story does. It's as if you visited yourself.
Yes. Thanks, Comrade Lindsay. So, so now, I mean, you guys have got a campaign going to isolate Israel politically, to call for an arms embargo, and the suspension of all commercial ties and trade with Israel. How's the government responding to this?
Well, for the moment, the government has ignored our recent pressure. But, you know, we don't expect them to take note on the spot. This is something, it depends how much support we can build up amongst the people of Mauritius as to how much attention they will pay. And it also depends on how clear, you know, now that we have this clear guideline to work towards the UN, going to the ICJ, and after an inquiry to see if there is an apartheid state. This is such a clear thing to get support on that we think we can now build it up much better than in the last few years. We were doing actions with others, you know, in a loose common front, but now that we've come together, it will be much easier to plan things ahead and to work hard at them. And also, you know, we've got from the boycott and disinvestment and sanctions point of view, which is another part of the struggle. More recently here, the Central Electricity Board, which is like the government corporation that makes electricity. They've set up some sub you know, companies, smaller companies, and one of them has made a contract with an Israeli firm to do really very sensitive work in terms of setting up a kind of information network that will get attached to the network of the electricity. So we've got this to take on. Secondly, the man who was prison commission, the previous prison commissioner, he had gotten Israeli experts to come and see about, you know, they were having problems in the prison when if they smuggled in telephones within the central prison, then they were also, you know, messing up everybody in the vicinity's phones. And so they went and got an Israeli company to come and do something about that. And then also the Puma label is quite common in Mauritius. And so we'll be able to focus on that as well. So it's two that concern the government and one that concerns the private sector. So we've got things to aim at. And this is the way you mobilize to by having something practical, and then also this long-term thing through the ICJ, which we know about in Mauritius now because of the success we've had through forcing the government to go that route over the Chagos issue.
Yes, you know, one of the things that I remember very clearly about the anti-apartheid movement, we had a very solid network based in between the Nordic countries and the Netherlands. And they were focusing particularly on below the radar things. The arms trade between South Africa and Israel, petroleum deals between Arab countries and South Africa, often via Israel. Because one of the things that the Israeli lobby is very good at is this sanctions busting, below the radar, arms smuggling. I mean, everything is possible in the name of the survival of the state of Israel. And there are such kinds of entities, inside the Palestine Solidarity Movement, but really one should go back to some of the strategies that were used. I mean, I remember in the Netherlands particularly, there was a church group that specialized on sanctions busting and on petroleum. I think it was called, my memory fails me now. I don't want to say Kairos, possibly Kairos. But yeah, but inside South Africa, you've got the funny situation where we've got a fairly strong Jewish community, well, relatively strong Jewish community. And I think after the United States, or they could have been overtaken, they're the most Zionist community in the world. And one of the interesting things is that in the leadership of this community, the obligation that they have to report to the people, we are doing something about these BDS people, we are doing something about the government's anti-Israeli position. They are forced to, in their media, disclose some stuff. I don't suppose you've got an organized Zionist community in Mauritius that forces the community itself to disclose the kinds of things that they get up to. And so all the information about Israeli-Mauritian dealings, I guess, activists have to dig up themselves. Is that the case?
Yeah, it is the case, because the Jewish community here is very, very, very small, really small. And that's also interesting, for another reason. And that's that in Mauritius, even though there's a very small Jewish community, to show the force of international right-wing ideology, colonial ideology, there's quite a lot of anti-Semitism without a Jewish community. And so this is also very, very shocking and very important to take into account.
Okay, I don't really want to completely go off the topic, but this is one fascinating thing. Even in Second World War in Japan, there was a huge amount of anti-Semitism, despite the fact that there were no Jews in Japan. And in Japanese fiction and even in the comic literature, the Jew was depicted as the boogeyman, so this is kind of just a fascinating thing about anti-Semitism. It's very sad, of course. Yeah.
I suppose, when we deal with whether it's apartheid or whether it's the Israeli state, what we're dealing with is these anachronistic forms of colonialism that, the Chagos example, the Diego Garcia example is more recent, still 1967. But from 1948, that's the year I was born, incidentally, the 1948, we have the beginning of the apartheid system, and we have the beginning of the setting up of the Israeli state in Palestine on the basis of the sort of terra nilla. Both of them will be bound to have to rely upon all sorts of very strong kind of forms of pressure in order to survive. And then I suppose in the opposite direction, we have this Western civilization having this very heavy, I won't say guilt, because I'm not even sure lots of people feel the guilt, but responsibility for the anti-Semitism, for centuries of anti-Semitism, and for not resolving this kind of racism, form of racism, within their own societies. And I suppose that, it's one of the, another one of the kind of anachronistic parts of what was really the worst of the capitalist system in Europe and its colonies and its ex-colonies. Anti-Semitism has sort of outlived the rest of the colonial dialogue.
Lindsay, say I've often kind of echoed what you've just said. And I do think that there is a serious connection between the European treatment of the Jews, either the actual treatment or turning a blind eye when the Nazi Holocaust was happening. But at the same time, I think there's also a strong residue of much deeper anti-Semitism that Europe hasn't really dealt with. And a quick way of dealing with it is unfettered support for the state of Israel. And we get over with it.
There is an element of that.
Yes, but I really don't know if the guilt is that serious a part of it. Because if it was the guilt, that why the utter indifference to the Holocaust of the Herero people by the Germans in Southwest Africa or in German Southwest Africa. So it's in some ways part of guilt, but very selective. Partly, I think it's okay. I mean, sorry, it's your interview and I'm throwing. I mean, like, it's like, how could we, white people, do this to other white people? And so much of this has to do, I think, with white privilege. Because until today, if you look at Belgium and the Congo, for example, or Germany and Namibia, there's been nothing forthcoming. So even the guilt that Europe displays towards international Jewry, it's a guilt that has to be displayed. I'm not denying that in any way, but I'm saying that even that guilt, it's part of a larger dynamic of white racism, of a white kind of supremacy. And this is why, I mean, when it happens to the people of these Mauritian Islands, history can happily just repeat itself over and over again, because those lives don't matter. Millions of lives can die in your occupation, in your wars of occupations and so on, but they're not white lives, so who cares? Anyway, I mean, you didn't ask for all of my editorializing.
No, I think that what's important about that is the blindness of so many people to the suffering of the Palestinian people. I mean, it proves your point. It does prove your point. And, you know, we, at the time when the Western part of capitalism, at any rate, is on a very strong decline, as we've seen with Trump. And I suppose that this will exacerbate all sorts of contradictions and all sorts of conflicts. But there are also other things which, you know, go in the opposite direction, where within the United States, which is the main force that has allowed the impunity of Israel, it really is. I don't think anyone even doubts it. That within the United States, there's been a change in the balance of power on the question of support for Palestinian people. I've noticed over the last, I would guess maybe you've also got an idea, 10 years. On the ground, exactly, on the ground, in very, very real ways on the ground. And there's been quite a groundswell of people within faith-based organizations as well, within the Jewish community, taking a very strong, very brave stand. And I suppose, you know, the way that those big parties in the US are run is also under, you know, it's under scrutiny now by ordinary people because of the election of Trump, you know, a white supremacist. And so I think that we can only hope that within the United States, in the belly, as they say, of the beast, people are now beginning to put into question things that perhaps in the past they didn't put into question. And I think even this thing about American lives being more important has taken a hard hit when the American system has allowed 500,000 people to be killed by an illness that could have been contained. So I think that everything's always changing in the world. And although in some ways the situation for the Palestinian people seems to be very bleak at the moment, after the Trump and Netanyahu and Mohammed bin Salman trio have really, kind of made clear that there are lots of people that Palestinians thought from a state point of view were allies that aren't. But at the same time, that allows us from Africa to use the African Union, SADC first and African Union, to support this move to formally accuse the Israeli state of apartheid. I think this will help people who are overcoming those past prejudices to overcome them better. And really, we are working towards finishing off the last bits of colonialism. It's not the empire, it's not capitalism yet, but some of these more horrific parts of colonization really have to be put to rest. So we have to win back. It's like there's a matrix for us in Mauritius of three struggles: the Palestinian people struggle, the struggle that was in South Africa for apartheid, and the struggle in Mauritius on Chagos and Chagos Garcia. And these struggles they come together again in history. Huh? Look at the way it was the Israeli and French state that helped to set up the South African apartheid nuclear arsenal. And then when the ANC government, it was a fantastic thing that Nelson Mandela and the ANC government did, they agreed to dismantle the entire nuclear armaments system in exchange for a nuclear arms-free Africa. And that was the birth of the Pelindaba Treaty for a Nuclear Arms-Free Africa. So now, when the USA has a military base on Chagos, Chagos Garcia, which is part of Mauritius is part of Africa, that military base has become illegal under a binding treaty that Pelindaba is. So we can call at the same time for IAEA inspections under that ASCON system. It's been set up, I think, in South Africa under the Pelindaba Treaty. But just to see how we have Israel today with secret nuclear weapons that the USA doesn't even agree to admit they've got them. And so you've got a nuclear issue that affects everybody in Africa. It's something that came out of the resolution, the positive thing out of the resolution of the apartheid system in South Africa, and how now we can use it again. Well, this is important for us in Lalita. We really want, and everybody in the common front that we set up, so MALP, we want the base closed down. This differentiates us from different Mauritian governments who only want the decolonization part. But we want the base to be closed down.
Yes.
And we know that it's got nuclear parts or nuclear material there. And strangely, it links to something else you said. It was a Netherlands trade union, Dockers Union, that sent us bills of lading in the early 80s to prove that there was nuclear material going to Chagos Garcia. And then more recently, when there were big demonstrations against bases, in Lalit, we've been in this no bases movement as well. When we went to these different no bases movements, I've lost my train of thought. I thought of something else that linked us. Anyway, I was going to come to the point now. I've lost my train of thought. I'll get it back. But anyway, perhaps you could. What was it? What? Yeah, we found out that the US only can give aid to Israel if it hasn't got nuclear weapons. So that's also, again, links us together. Both the Palestinian struggle and the struggle in Mauritius and the struggle in South Africa. And, while we were at those no bases meetings, there was one in India, and I had to speak in the name of the No Bases organization, and I was on a panel with Laila Khaled from the Palestinian organizations. So just to show how these are very interlinked movements.
Yes.
Have you anything more to ask me?
No, no. I don't have anything more to ask you, Lindsay. I thought that, I mean, I really enjoyed our conversation, your insights, and we do need to continue the connections, especially the organizational ties when we want to do more SADC stuff. And we will do a better job of letting you know what we have done with some of the other SADC countries, so that we can try to work towards some kind of coordination. Because, I mean, you know, South Africa is often seen as a bit of a bully boy in SADC. And on this position, I mean, on this situation, it has really good positions, but it needs to be, to have the cover of the other SADC countries as well. So we should do a little bit more closer liaison with each other in this regard, Lindsay. But it was,
and I think, yeah, it's been very good speaking to you. And I think that for the people of Palestine at a moment like this, one of those moments in history when everything seems difficult, but there are all sorts of new signs of hope all over the world. And we've got to build, I think, in the support for the Palestinian people on both the boycott and sanctions, and you know, this can be done in every country, as it's partly ideological, partly economic struggle. And at the same time, really, really isolate Israel on the basis that from the Jordan River right to the Mediterranean, Israel is running an apartheid state.
Comrade Lindsay, thank you very, very much. I really enjoyed this. I mean, and it was just lovely to be in touch and to speak to somebody like you, really, comrade.
Thank you very much. For me, it's been really an honor to be on the program with you. And it's a privilege, really. I feel that in our lives, we can participate. For me, it's like that anyway, in struggles, like the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, on Chagos. These are the international parts of our work. And, you know, they represent, we're taking on, it's not just the remnants of past colonization, it's the fault lines of present empire.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, comrade. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Enjoy the rest of your day.